My name is Mike Livermore. I am a law professor here. I teach environmental law, amongst other topics. And so I guess the topic of our little conversation today is about environmental law at UVA, what to think about maybe a little bit when thinking about a law school and the kind of different programs that you might be interested in. And then maybe just leave some time for you guys to have questions, and I'd be interested to chat with you about that. So just to kind of, again, get us started, maybe you could think about programs at a law school as having a few different characteristics, right? So this is true for environmental law, this is true for immigration, it's true for criminal law, kind of whatever you're potentially interested in. You can think of there being a couple different buckets of things that a program will have, very broadly, okay? So one that, and the most important to look at is the faculty that teach in that area, right? That's the thing that really is the kind of the core of the program, all right? And so here at UVA, we have several faculty that teach in the environmental law area and both teach and do research in the area. That's another thing too. I think I remember when I was an admitted student, I didn't really think that much about the faculty research that was happening. That's actually quite an important part of what we do, well, we think it is at least, and it also does affect the experience that students have. So for example, right now, I have several students working with me on research projects. So that's a fairly common experience for law students. So it's just something that you can put on your radar if it wasn't there already. So that's the first thing to look at, is who's kind of actively thinking about environmental law issues these days, like what's going on, okay? And we do have several, we have a handful of faculty. You can look we have a website, we can go look at our bios. So maybe I'll just talk a little bit about myself, what I do. So my interest in environmental law is longstanding. It was my first job out of high school, was working for an environmental organization. I worked for environmental organizations for several years, during college, after college. And then in law school, I really got focused on the intersection of environmental questions and economic questions, right? So how to think with economics about environmental issues. And that's what I've been kind of writing about and thinking about ever since then. So after law school, I clerked for a federal judge, and I started writing in this area. So I wrote a book that came out in 2008 called Retaking Rationality, which is about this question: how to use cost-benefit analysis, economic thinking to improve environmental decision-making. And so that was that. That was that book that came out in 2008. I started a center at NYU, actually, another good law school, but we have many advantages here at UVA. So I ran that center for 5 years, then I came here and I started to teach at UVA, and I've, again, been writing in this area of the intersection of economics and environmental law for the last 10 years. So that's just one example. And I teach the introductory environmental law class. I also teach a class on regulatory decision making that's kind of more general, but is very relevant for environmental law. Okay, so then we have other faculty. I'm not going to review all of our faculty. They're kind of on our website. You can look. We have lots of great folks teaching and writing in different areas. So that's one thing to look at, is the faculty, their research interests and what they're writing in, and then, of course, the curricula, right? You want to look at the classes that are offered. And there's two ways to think about this as well. So one, you can look at the kind of specialty environmental classes, right? Which makes sense. If you're like really interested in the environment, you're like, okay, I want to make sure, and there's like a core curriculum that you're going to be interested in. Environmental law, natural resources law, land use, there's several other classes like that. So that's important, and you want to make sure, when you're evaluating different programs, that's covered and you have good quality people teaching those classes. So that's another thing to look at. And again, I think we do pretty well there. But the other piece of this that I think is kind of special about UVA is we really encourage, I think, our students to also pursue like a solid general foundation in the law. Okay, so there are places where you could go and like only take environmental law classes, and I probably wouldn't recommend that. I don't think that's a great idea personally. I think what we do here is we have a very good, very, very solid, broad curricula, right? And then you can layer like your special interests on top of that, all right? So you're going to take administrative law with like top administrative law people, right? And that might not sound like it's directly relevant to the environment, but it's absolutely 100% foundational to environmental decision making in the US. Okay, so you take a solid administrative law class. We take classes on legislation, right? We have great class on legislation. Again, it maybe is a little obvious that legislation is relevant for environmental law, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and so on. But, what's important here is, yes, you could take a specialty class on the Clean Air Act, but also there's something very valuable about having that general foundation in a solid kind of legislation class. And there's lots of corporations work the same way. Just having that general foundation. So one thing to look at when evaluating a school are the specialty classes that they have in your areas, but also the quality of those core foundational classes is really, really vital. So I think that's another thing that kind of is special about UVA is our emphasis on that core and then building on top from that. Okay, so that's kind of the faculty and research. Second, the curriculum, and then balancing this kind of general versus specific. All right, so that's another kind of interesting thing to think about when comparing law schools. So the third thing are kind of extracurriculars and student activities, and those both at the more informal level and then at the more formal level. All right, and so we have something here at the law school which is called PLACE, the Program on Law, Communities, and the Environment, and that's kind of an umbrella that covers a bunch of different activities that are happening here at the law school. So I'll describe that kind of those together. So a couple of core institutions that we have is the student journal. We have a student journal that focuses on environmental issues. We also have something called VELF, the Virginia Environmental Law Forum, which is a student organization that brings in speakers. They're very active. They run a symposium. They have really great programming that they put on over the course of the year. Again, the student journal it's a law review. It's a student-run law journal that focuses specifically on environmental law issues. Okay, and so that's really interesting. It's a great opportunity to learn, kind of go deeper into environmental law questions, kind of see what's happening with scholarship, and do it in a kind of an empowering way because you're like in this role where you're actually shaping the next generation of environmental scholarship, and you're working with other students, which is a really wonderful thing. So, and what those two institutions kind of indicate as well is that we have a very robust community of environmental law students here, which is, again, another thing that can be a little hard to get a feel for, but is something that is an important characteristic of a law school that will differ between different law schools. And so, so we have, like I said, kind of a sufficient percentage of the student body are interested in environmental issues where you have a community of people that you can kind of interact with and will encourage you and all that kind of thing. So that's another kind of really interesting element about UVA, and again, something that distinguishes law schools. So PLACE, kind of in addition to the two kind of student-run organizations, there's also programming that happens through PLACE, basically. And PLACE has sponsored lots of different things over the years. PLACE sponsored a podcast that I ran for a couple of years. If you're interested, Free Range with Michael Livermore. You can get it on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. And so that was fun. That was something that was sponsored by PLACE, and there's about 50 episodes, and I interview law professors and economists and philosophers and journalists and people from all different kind of fields talking about challenges in environmental law and policy. So that's a kind of interesting resource that exists from PLACE, and then also PLACE sponsors conferences. So we have a wonderful conference happening this spring, which is going to focus on kind of the energy transition. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of talk about the energy transition. So really, it's kind of focusing on like transitional issues, like for example, coal communities, how to think about coal communities going forward. So so there's also that kind of PLACE-sponsored content. Another thing that I should mention that's more on the curricular side, but it's important to emphasize. So there's like I said, there's faculty and research interests, there's the kind of doctrinal classes, and then another core thing is the clinic, right? So most law schools will have that you're looking at probably will have some kind of environmental law clinic, but it's actually, you can compare and contrast different types and styles of doing that. So what we have here is very special. We have a full-time professor here, Cal Jaffe, who runs the clinic, and that's his whole job, to run the clinic, okay? So another option that sometimes exists is to have a clinic that is like somewhere else, like an environmental organization, and then you go work for that environmental organization. And that can be great. That can be a great opportunity. And we have things like that here as well. There's a whole kind of externship possibility. And so there's opportunities like that. But what we have here of having a full-time in-house law professor to run the environmental clinic really creates nice opportunities for the students. Because what you get out of that is the projects that Cal takes on are like tailored to provide the students with very interesting and useful from a learning perspective projects, basically. Things where you can take on important roles, things where there are kind of cutting edge issues. And so yes, I mean, working in an environmental organization can be really rewarding as well, because you see kind of like how the workflow comes in, but the projects aren't necessarily designed to help you learn the most as possible. They're not selected that much for that reason, right? They just kind of get thrown on something where you're useful. Whereas here, the projects are selected very much with that kind of pedagogical orientation in mind. Like what are the kind of projects where the students are going to learn the most. So I'll just describe one that is particularly interested, and part of the reason, and you can learn a little bit about this too afterwards. So the project, the clinic project, deals with a rural community in Central Virginia. There's a historic school in this community. The community is called Pine Grove, and what's important, historically important about this school is it was part of the first wave of schools that were created for black children in the United States after slavery, after the end of slavery. And so this school exists out in rural Virginia, and then there's a community of people that live there, and they use historically. Of course, the school was used as a school for a long time, but it's small, and it's like a little one-room schoolhouse, right? So eventually the students moved into the more modern, kind of schooling system. But then the building and facility was used as a community center for a while. In any case, this is a really wonderful, important, historic asset. And then where the clinic comes in is there's an effort to put in a mega landfill all throughout that area, okay? Near the school, all through in the rural community, and so that is kind of an environmental justice issue for obvious reasons, and the clinic has been working with the community over the last several years to kind of oppose the landfill, represent the community's interests in that particular struggle. If you're interested in learning more about that, we have actually we Workplace sponsored a short film. That's kind of like 15 minutes long, that describes the history of the school and then the current struggle. It's called Pine Grove, More Than a School. You can find it. It's available online. And we were entered and we were featured in, I don't know, half a dozen or something like that, festivals throughout this season. So it's quite a high quality film, I will say. So you can check that out. If it wasn't so long, I'd actually would play it in this context. So in any case, so you can look at Pine Grove film, and that will give you a really nice sense, I think, about what makes UVA law special from an environmental perspective. One, you get a feel for the clinic, which is nice. And again, it's an important part of the experience for environmental law students here. But two, you get a sense of the setting, right? Because there's different places where law schools are, right? You can go to a law school in a big city. That's most of the options are like that. Charlottesville is different. We're not you may have noticed, we're not in a big city. We are we're in the middle of Central Virginia, but we have access to things differently as a consequence of that. You can still go to Richmond, and there are still kind of state-oriented things that happen, and a lot of the clinic work actually, deals with, state issues, and, you're thinking about the state capitol. But also this kind of rural communities and thinking in that direction as well, right? And Appalachia, issues associated with that, issues associated with mining. And so we're in this kind of interface between, a more, kind of urban environment or more kind of, state-oriented politics, say, in Richmond, and then also, this kind of rural space as well. So that is quite an interesting characteristic of UVA, I think, that distinguishes us from other law schools. I also just mentioned, thinking about kind of scales, you have the local, like Pine Grove, you have state, which is now more than ever an important policymaking venue in environmental law. But of course, we also have a national orientation and a global orientation, right? So I'll just mention those briefly. So most of my writing and most of my work has had a national orientation, and to a certain extent a global orientation. We're close to DC, right? We also have clinics that are federally oriented, right? We have our federal appellate court clinic. We do Supreme Court litigation through those clinics. A lot of our faculty are oriented towards thinking about questions of presidential power, for example, right? And then we have a strong global component as well, where we have faculty in general who are oriented globally towards global institutions, global trade, global business, and so on, but also comparative as well. So we have excellent people working in comparative law. Great. Okay. Well, that's just a very general overview of the program here, and some of the things to think about.